Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Daily Medieval Podcast. Today, we are joined by a passionate military historian whose journey into the realm of academia has been nothing short of inspiring. Transitioning from a 30-year career as a store manager in various retail businesses, he made a bold decision to pursue his lifelong passion for history, particularly military history. Today, he brings us an exciting new book called Byzantium's Twilight, Strategic Failures That Crushed an Empire. So without further ado, please welcome Michael Stroud.
Hello, Luke. Thanks for having me.
You're more than welcome. Thank you for coming on. So I guess, really, as I touched on there, you've got absolutely fascinating stories. So before we get to the history, let's talk about your history. So
Sure.
where did your pursuit for history begin?
Sure, absolutely. History kind of really piqued my interest at a very young age. My father served in the Vietnam War. He served with the American Army in the 101st Airborne Division from 1969 to January 1972. So when I was very young, I remember coming across his Army uniform hanging up in our closet, and I had to be 5 or 6, and it just intrigued me as to what all that meant. All this, all the medals and all the stuff on it, and even at a really young age, and so that just grabbed my interest. So the library became my best friend very early on about wanting to just even as a young age. I mean, I think I checked out the same book so many times. The librarians would just say, "Okay, Michael, here they are." It just became a regular thing. So for me, with history and especially military history, it started because of my father and then the family. And over the years, as my interest in history continued to only grow in every aspect, but military history, all eras, that I wanted to find out more about my family's connection as well. So putting that all together, I've been able to research more of late my family's connection in the military. And besides my father, I had both grandfathers in World War II. One was a medic in the army, and he was in the Rome campaign and the Germany campaign of World War II, which was amazing. And a few stories from him over the years. One of my grandmothers worked with German prisoners of war in our state here, that they would bring some out to their vegetable farms, and so they could do work. And I remember
Oh
hearing
wow.
stories about that.
Mm.
But it goes back to World War One. I have an ancestor that was in the Spanish American War, three ancestors in the Civil War, one in the Revolutionary War, and I just found out of late that I have ancestors that go back to that were Burgesses in the 1600s. And so it's quite interesting. So for me, it just kind of
Yeah.
fosters and builds. It's kind of in my DNA,
Yeah.
actually. So it's always been exciting.
Yeah, no, clearly. But it's interesting that kind of what you say there is your focus and inspiration comes from a lot of the modern military history, the American Civil War, Vietnam War, World War II. What then inspired you then to now go on to the Byzantines?
Sure. Well, as I said, I have a lot of what's called modern history, but I love the ancient world. And anytime everybody says, "Well, what are your main eras?" It's really tough because I research and write about almost every era to a certain point, but I've always been fascinated by ancient times, medieval times. I've been to Rome, I've been to the
Mm,
Colosseum, I've been to Pompeii, I've been around. I like to actually visit the places I read and write about because to me that's so immensely helpful in just bringing it to life.
mm,
So Byzantium kind of really stemmed from a trip I took not too many years back to Rome, and it just kind of springboarded off from that. And then some of my classes I've had since I've been in school as well just kind of led me down the rabbit hole of what was Byzantium really about. What did it mean to be Byzantine, and what
mm.
was that impact on it? So it just became another rabbit hole I went down and got intrigued by all the facets and components. I know there are many historians that spend entire careers just around the Byzantine Empire, and different structures. So for me, I became intrigued by its longevity, but what were the signs that there were cracks in the foundation, if you will?
Right.
So for me, that's what to me, I saw three common threads that really I thought kind of were foreshadowing
Mm,
its eventual fall. Now, yes, it took almost 1,000 years of being around, and I've had some interesting, well, let's say, conversations with other really established historians saying, "Well, it lasted until this year." I go, "That's fine, and that's true." However, what about the possibility that all the fracturing began long before? rarely does an empire just collapse overnight, anyways.
Mm,
It's always usually a gradual process of decay, different things occur. Western Roman Empire was around a long time, and it had phases that would lead to its collapse eventually. But the Byzantine Empire was the same way. I just think what helps their case is they were able to fake it till you make it a little bit more. I think for a longer period of time, for modern parlance, if you will. I just think they were able to cover it up easier over the course of time. So for me, it just intrigued off my visit to Rome and kind of went down the rabbit hole to dig into it more.
and now you have the book, which is really interesting. I was able to read a little bit of it,
Oh,
but
okay.
what's really interesting is, as you say there, that there was this longevity in the collapse. And I guess for those who aren't aware of what these events are, could you elaborate on what some of these key failures that you
Yep.
talk about in the book that led to its eventual demise in the 15th century?
In my research and what I identified in my mind, there were three key things. One, that the aggressive wars of expansion,
Mm,
Justinian the First, especially, I think, was both a savior and a detriment to the flourishing of the Byzantine Empire in that he aggressively pursued expanding the territory that his empire, i.e., Rome, in his mind, held. And he was able to expand it to the biggest breadth that it would ever have.
mm,
But there's a cost at that. And these were really unsustainable wars financially, but manpower wise as well. And I think that really was kind of the old adage, having a bigger appetite than you can actually afford to eat. The second part is unsustainable turning internal building programs and social programs. The Byzantine Empire, especially under Justinian as well, went on a massive, basically, infrastructure plan. In the United States, there's always this push. We're redoing infrastructure. We're rebuilding everything. Well, Justinian took that to the nth degree. I mean, they experienced various earthquakes that devastated a lot of buildings. So he used that as his precursor to say, great, I can put my stamp on it and we'll rebuild bigger and better than ever and really bring the glory of Rome to Constantinople and the Byzantine Empire. So just massive programs of rebuilding in every facet from Constantinople to other sites all over. But on top of that, he also instituted social programs that basically provided free food to the poor, free health care, a lot of these things that sound great. Well, what's the cost, both short term and long term? The cost was enormous, and as we get into it, we'll talk a little bit about what was the financial cost of that, even during his time, because it's really staggering when you think about the amount that was expended at his time. It's
mm,
a lot of money in today's terms. Then it's unimaginable. And then the third thing was the rise of Islamic armies. Um, Islam came about in the Arabian Peninsula, and it was a slow build, but about the 1600s is when it really kicked off to where they were starting to expand. And there really wasn't a coherent, long term, sustainable geopolitical strategy from the Byzantine Empire to cope with that.
mm.
And that really just took chunks away at a time and ate away over time to where they just, with no sustainable strategy, and they lost more and more ground, which affected other areas. We'll talk about that. That was just a lose lose. So you have enemy armies you have no strategy for, unsustainable internal building programs and healthcare programs, and aggressive wars of expansion. It's a triumvirate of things that don't bode well for the long term.
No, definitely. It's interesting there. So you identify these key factors. So when you were writing your book, what sources did you use to kind of draw these very distinct failures, and what difficulties did you have when writing about them?
Well, I think I'll take that in a little bit of the reverse order because the difficulty, the main one I had, was locating great source material from the Islamic point of view.
Right.
Islamic sources were very challenging to get the information I was trying to get. I will say a great contemporary book that I found to be extremely helpful was by Robert G. Hoyland. It's called In God's Path: The Arab Conquest and the Creation of an Islamic Empire. That was
Mm,
a fantastic and very helpful book. I used dozens of resources, but that one was very helpful from that Islamic growth perspective as well. So that by far was always the tough component. Trying to find primary source material was very tough too. Translation issues, accessibility online. I can't just take a quick trip to the Middle East, so that was a bit
yeah.
challenging. But I was able to pull together some great material from different sources.
Mm,
But when it came to other key sources, there's a lot of good ones, so I kind of broke it down, I guess, to about four.
mm,
There's an author by the name of Charles Deal that wrote an excellent book in 2005 called Byzantium Greatness in Decline. Extremely great book. It really breaks down the breadth of the empire. To me, that's kind of like a must have. Of course, the old sources, Procopius, The Secret History and the History of Wars.
yeah.
I mean, that was a no brainer early on, immensely helpful, great information. Very much always take those, as you know, with a grain of salt, though, because there's a lot of bias in those, but it gives you some good material to work with. Absolutely. Michael Whitby in 2021 released a great book called The Wars of Justinian. Excellent book, really great about the military aspects and the campaigns that occurred under Justinian, the formation of the armies, the structure. And then the last one I would say that's extremely helpful too is Brian Todd Carey, his book Road to Manzikert, the Byzantine and Islamic Warfare, also from 2021. Really great material from beginning to end, really methodical in the process, easily accessible. So I
Yeah.
would say out of the dozens of sources I use, those are probably the top
Mm.
bits of information I would say.
No, fantastic. And I like the idea of changing perspective and looking at it from a kind of an Islamic side. I mean, when
Yep.
you're looking at it from different perspectives like that and through different sources, were there kind of factors that maybe that we've overlooked that contributed to the decline of the Byzantines that you uncovered during your research?
What I found and is that one of the common threads about the strength of the empire
Mm,
really rested solely on who was in charge.
mm,
It literally the entire success in the periods of the Byzantine Empire really came from the strength of who the emperor was. When you look even beyond Justinian, like Basil II, he was a very strong leader militarily and otherwise, so the empire tended to do well. When there wasn't so, they had a lot more internal strife. They were not effective on the field. But even those strong leaders like Justinian and Basil II,
mm,
what I saw was generally good intentions at the beginning, where they wanted to restore the glory of Rome, make it an empire of the people. But in short order, it became more about consolidation of power, edicts on the representative, both politically and religiously, of everything to do with the empire. So it quickly became consolidation of power to the one, often at the expense of the many, which happened over and over again.
yeah.
So I think it's easy to overlook that when you're just saying, well, they were around 1,000 years, blah blah blah. Okay, but let's look at some minutia, like what occurred during that 1,000 years.
Yeah.
How did it? And you could almost create graphs about like how they would go up and down, and the ups were almost always strong emperors.
Mm,
Had usually had reforms that were strengthened the empire. But the ironic part with that, without going too far off, is that doing that at the same time almost weakened the empire based on just the natural structure of it, which was consolidation of power instead of putting power more back into the people, which would create more stability over time. So it's quite interesting. So for me, I started seeing, I felt those were the threads I started to see throughout the history of the empire.
yeah, no, definitely. And I guess that's it makes sense then why you, for instance, focus so much on the impact of say Justinian. And it's
Yep.
really interesting going back to one of your sources, Procopius, he says that about Justinian that he was entrusted by God with this commission to watch
Yep.
over the whole Roman Empire and
Yep.
so far as possible to remake it. Now,
Yep.
in my upcoming book, my second chapter is about Justinian and the age of Justinian. And so he is this formidable character, and I'm interested because I wonder if we've wrote about him in very different lights. From your research, what do you think of Justinian?
I think he was, in my opinion, I believe he was one of the last Roman idealists,
Mm,
truly, at least early in his reign. I felt he morphed more into a little bit more the typical emperor, let's say, facade. But I think early on he was in his own mind, at least as we know it in history,
mm,
that I believe he was truly committed to the Roman cause. The fact that he was a Roman emperor that actually spoke Latin was almost unheard of because they were already pretty much past all that at that point. But he was still believed so strongly. He was educated as Rome. He felt he was the light in the world, bringing Rome's high technology, high culture to the world. He thought it was his mandate, as you said, to bring that back. So I really felt he was committed to the cause, if you will, early on.
Yeah.
But I also feel, as so often happens, that that the accumulation of power more and more also starts to warp how you lead. And his role as leader in both a religious capacity but a political one definitely saw him instituting more and more measures that where he would have opponents outright killed, as opposed that's not really thinking so well of your people if you're just willy-nilly able to, I don't like him, he's against me, he needs to be done. And he was doing that more and more.
Yeah.
I think a great example of where he was fearful of losing power was the Nika riots. When that happened, and a lot of people fail to really appreciate the that occurrence because it was a knife on a knife's edge that the empire almost collapsed. And really, it was his wife, Theodora, that really put a backbone in him and said, "You're not going to run. You're the emperor. You need to fix this right now." And
Mm.
really kind of put him in check. So she's equally formidable as a side as another person to discuss another time. She is no joke on it, but she really put a backbone in him. And when he kind of gathered himself again in that particular instance and sent Belisarius and others out to quash the riots, they ended up taking it to the hippodrome and killing like 30,000 civilians. That's a pretty overt sign that he's really about his authority and power as opposed to the people first.
No, definitely, and it's interesting. It's something that I've often thought about, and I wonder your thoughts on it too. Obviously, as I just said about Procopius, this idea of entrusting Justinian with to rebuild the Roman Empire, and you say there about kind of his pursuit to do that. If in a sort of what if scenario,
Mhm.
if Justinian had instead consolidated the regions and left North Africa, Italy, etc., the West do its own
Mhm.
thing, do you think they would have been in a better position to face the likes of Islam, internal crises, crusades, these future failures that you then go on to talk about that kind of, the domino is set off with Justinian?
I believe with that kind of what if scenario, which are always fun, that it would definitely have, I believe, exponentially increased their potential for longevity. And the reasons are a few around that. One, when you have less territory that you have to guard and protect, you can consolidate what you have more, and therefore build up your infrastructure more appropriately. Now, granted, by trading off territory, they lost revenue from taxes and they lost their ability to feed themselves. Egypt alone accounted for 30% of the food for the Byzantine Empire.
Mm,
So, however, they were also really the best merchant traders of the day. So they had shipping. I mean, they used to call the Mediterranean Sea the Byzantine Sea at the time because the Byzantine Empire was so strong. They basically everybody wanted to trade with them. So really, what they could have done at that point, if they traded that territory and kind of shrunk in slightly and made it stronger, was further develop and enhance their international trade, and
mm,
that would help to offset that. And that would mean having more money available for the lesser territory, where that they could more properly defend, because they always struggled with manpower. I
mm,
mean, more and more, and having that territory is great, but yeah, guess what? You have to have the money and the men to defend all that land, and that was a huge struggle. So shrinking that down, strengthen your internal systems militarily, but also you can further develop your economic trade, which would also boost your income as well. So I think that would have been a huge plus in many, many ways and probably offset their decline and fall even more.
no, definitely. So, I guess moving away then from Justin, and he kind of gets the ball rolling, and you write something really interesting, which is that although the empire collapses in the mid 15th century, its fate was sealed by the 1100s. And I wondered if you could touch upon that. Why that date? What went down there that kind of then was sealed the fate? I mean, 300 years then before its final collapse.
Yep. I think really where it comes about was the amount of, I think the really the beginning of the fracturing of the base of the empire truly came from the amount of money that was spent under Justinian's reign.
Mm,
And that's important because that directly affected every successor after that by having less to build upon from before because of the treasury. What's interesting and real important to note is Justinian, we don't know exactly how much was in the treasury when he took office when he became emperor. However, we do know roughly what his predecessor left about the time he
Mm.
died, and it was about 320,000 pounds of gold. So when you translate that roughly into what that would roughly account to today, that is $7.7 billion in today's money.
Right.
That's roughly what Justinian came in having.
Mm.
That's an enormous amount of money, even in today's terms. But then it's unheard of. And there were contemporary reports that were really damning of Justinian by how fast he was spending all the money on just building everything and going to war with everybody from the Persians to in North Africa. He was just constantly, and then back to Italy. He was just, and that takes an enormous amount of money. Now, early on, that all went great. But by the latter part of his reign, the military wasn't being paid efficiently or effectively or at all. That causes a lot of problems. You had breakdown in social programs and social order because it wasn't sustainable financially to keep doing all the things he wanted. So that really is a huge problem for the successors after him because they would come into office and have social disorder, geopolitical threats on every border, and unrest. So all and a depleted treasury on top of that. Now, yes, they would have more, they would accumulate some battlefield wins and different things over the hundreds and hundreds of years, but it never reached the level that it did then.
Mm.
So I think that's really the crux. If you had to come down to one thing in my mind, it was the massive financial expenditure because no situation, no government, no entity, both now and then, can survive indefinitely if you have no viable, consistent income source. And I think he just destroyed it so much that it would limp forward for the remainder of its time, never be as financially solvent consistently as it was going into his reign. Now, again, I know my historian friends out there will be like, well, we had six. Yes, there were six, but like I said, there are peaks and valleys. But I
Yeah.
feel this instance, specifically under his reign, with that amount of money spent, was just too devastating to the long term effects
Mm.
of the empire. I think.
Yeah, and another one of those like valleys that you then talk about, and which there's a lot of emphasis on, is obviously with their military failures, the Battle of Manzikert. I don't know if I'm saying that right, but
Yep, yep,
um,
they're good.
why was this battle so significant in the wider narrative of their failure and fall?
That tends to well the Manzikert Battle of 1071 tends to be a watershed, if you will,
Mm.
militarily, but also for the empire itself, that it was in its waning days. Now we know it would still take hundreds of years before the actual collapse, but that is seen as a hallmark moment of the destruction of the last major Byzantine army in the field, where they were so severely ravaged on the battlefield that greatly affected their prestige and their influence in the Mediterranean and the wider world that they could never recover. So when you lose that kind of influence, your enemies continue to eat away at you, just
Mm.
pushing, just coming in. They had already been struggling with that as it was through a variety of battlefield losses, reverses, losing more and more land. This was just kind of like opening the gate even more. Like you saw a Byzantine emperor out and about with men. His field army is devastated. So now they are not the preeminent power. They are a minor power at best, and it's kind of like sharks in the water. They smell blood. Guess what? It brings out everybody to come after you even more. So it really that's why Manzikert is such a big deal history wise when it comes to the Byzantine Empire. The crushing of their main field army just kind of opened the gate for the remaining fall. Even though it was like a slow death, it still was the beginning of the end.
Mm.
How a lot of historians see it.
Yeah, no, definitely, and of course, not 20 years later, you then have Alexios Komnenos calling for the crusade because he realizes he can't take all of this on with Persia and then the Arabs and everything, and
Yeah.
so it's interesting because the Byzantines had a very tumultuous relationship with the papacy in the West, and it seems like in this after the battle there, where they're heavily defeated, they kind of do have to turn to their um, to the West basically for help.
Yeah.
Basically, how did the Byzantium's diplomatic relationships with other powers in Europe and the Middle East influence its strategic position and eventual downfall?
Yeah, that's a great one because that relationship alone was very interesting. It's a
Mm,
really interesting thing to dig into because early on with the creation of the eastern half, they were still very strongly associated with the papacy. And even in Justinian's time, there are documents that speak to recognizing the Pope and the papal power as the preeminent religious center of the empire.
mm,
But that would shift and begin to shift, and the schism would widen considerably over like the next 400 years or so, give or take. And that really came about as the Byzantine emperors brought more power into themselves, seeing themselves, well, wait a minute, I'm the emperor of the only existing Roman Empire, but I'm also the representative of the religious power of God within the empire. Maybe not the Pope that's over there, that's really doesn't have a lot of authority anymore, militarily, let's say, land wise. So why do we keep adhering to what they're saying?
yeah.
I'm the light of the Roman Empire. I'm the word. So they really effectively really were making themselves as emperor
Mm,
and as pope, right? So they were emperor and pope, which didn't sit well with the papacy because they obviously were like, hold on, we are the rock, we are the religious center of Christianity. So that really, they had a grudging working relationship for a long time, and that would affect a lot of things in regards to militarily and geopolitically, as your question poised, because it really became a us versus them. So much so that the papacy sought military help against the Byzantines on the peninsula after they had a short respite where they actually recaptured a lot of Italy. That didn't last long, and then it led to more conflict between the Pope and his backers pushing back against the Byzantines and their version of Christianity. So it really just continued to fracture more and more as it went, becoming us versus them.
mm,
Even though in theory they were both Christians, they were Christians with different ultimate purposes, I guess
mm,
is a good way I would like to say, between the Byzantine Christians and the Italian Christians, or the Italian half, we'll say.
mm,
So for me, that's what I see as kind of the it really became a matter of who's more powerful, the actual emperor of what's left of Rome, which
mm,
is the Eastern Roman Empire, or the Pope, and he's got a little, in their mind, a city that's small on the whole peninsula. So it was kind of a matter of power and acquisition of power, and it became a dual role for the
mm.
Byzantine Empire.
No,
So
definitely.
self-created, of course, but it was still their projection of their power, that they were the light for their people in military situations, but religious ones as well.
Mm. No, definitely. And religion, as you say there, it plays an extraordinary role in Byzantine's history. I mean, from the age of Justinian, where you've got schisms with Chalcedonians, Monophysites, and all a whole host of religious sects that there's more than you can name. To then
Yes.
the likes of with the rise of Islam, you've then got the iconoclast period and everything.
Yep.
I mean, how important was religion to the failure of the Byzantines?
Re- religion, it's, I think there's a lot of irony in that because there, how do I want to phrase this? The, the irony with religion for them is that it was projected as being all important. But I think as the empire evolved, it had a prominent place, absolutely. But I think, in my opinion, just based on the material and the sources we have, it became more as a means to an end for the Byzantine Empire. I felt it became a way to help secure as much as they could the support of the population, especially, and the goodwill of other Christian nations. As your point, the Crusades, a call to God for help. But really, it was more of a call to God for help because we don't have enough men to fight this. So let's use religion as a good way to get, as a potential way to get more support.
Mm,
Um, the irony too is that the Islamic expansion was religion based too, because it helped drive their armies out of the Arabian Peninsula for trying to seek converts to Islam. So it was a religious based motivation there, just like religion was a motivator for the Byzantine Empire. The motivations weren't always clear cut, but it came into play often about the iconography rallying point of who they were, what they offered to the Western world as a whole. So they really were projecting themselves as a center of Christianity to the Western world. They were the bastion of it. So when it was threatened in their mind because they lost so much territory and were so bereft of the resources they had in the old days, which further points to my feeling of how Justinian kind of blew it for them early on, that religion just became another source of, for them, of importance, but importance in more than just a religious sense for the people, an importance politically as well.
Mm. No, definitely, and it's interesting to that all of these factors then kind of combine and play in together. What lessons then can modern powers learn from the strategic failures of the Byzantines?
It's a great question, and I think it's safe to say our great powers in today's world don't seem to learn much, anyways. just a just a little stance there. But taking the question to heart, I think there are a lot of things that can be taken from the lessons of Byzantium. That anytime there's a strong consolidation of power to one
Mm,
person, generally, it tends to bode ill for the longevity of the empire itself. So there are examples throughout all of history, from where we're talking about now to when you look at various periods of Rome before, all over the world, China, Japan. When it becomes unchecked and more acquisition of power, eventually will force basically it forces a change of thought on the population's mentality and psyche around what's the benefit to me. I'm doing all the work, I'm being driven into the ground for somebody way away that's living an opulent lifestyle. That really, in a lot of ways, is no different in a contemporary society now.
mm,
As more power, except for now, we have prime ministers and figureheads. But what we have now is, instead of one person, it tends to be a consolidation of power in governmental entities. So the feelings are the same. So the lesson is learned. So the lesson I see out of that is you need to be very mindful of who's accumulating the power and what's the intent. Because if you work through the people, the population, you're going to ensure greater stability socially, economically, but militarily as well. When it becomes a consolidation of power for power's sake, that's when it always goes very bad in the long term.
mm,
I would say that's one. The second one is expansionist. Expansion for the expense of expansion is always bad. We saw it with, as the empire was committed, I have to regrow to the size that we were strong and big. Okay, you achieved success, but it wasn't sustainable. And
mm,
that really caused a collapse in a lot of other areas in the long term, economically, geopolitically, and all those. The same thing can apply now. I mean, we're in a modern world where things are very different in a lot of contexts of what war is about, especially economics. The world is so intertwined economically that if one major economic power like the United States went down financially, it would probably take the whole world with it, because we carry the biggest amount of debt, but also the biggest amount of financial positive gains for others. So expansionism now can be related to economic expansionism when you seek to do more than what is sustainable and realistic. So that's a very real threat now, and I think that really translates from territorial expansion in ancient period to modern economic expansionism now. That it just isn't sustainable. I mean, my country alone, we see it where we're many trillions of dollars in debt, which makes basically the equivalent of hundreds of thousands of dollars that each American would have to pay, and it goes up to an extent that's unrealistic and it's not sustainable. It's just a matter of when that point is hit.
mm,
So the same thing applies. So I think those two lessons alone are significant and should be adhered to now, and take steps that can adjust and mitigate that disaster. It's not if it'll happen, it's when it will happen at the point we're in now. So if somebody would have cautioned Justinian and his ancestors and those that came after him to about, it's better to have some territory that's solid and strong internally and otherwise than having a lot of territory that you can't hold and that is collapsing the empire.
mm.
So one is definitely much better than the other.
No, definitely, and kind of going back to then the study itself, looking beyond the kind of Byzantines. What insights does the study of the strategic failures offer to understanding the rise and fall of empires throughout history, such as, say, the British Empire?
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. So with the British Empire, it was always that's an interesting case study in itself because it was a small island nation, finite number of resources, manpower wise. So how'd they offset that? They offset it by technology, i.e., ships that they were able to have more of and generally better quality of than others. Um, they had better training with the men that manned those ships, but then they are also able to use those ships to increase themselves financially, which allowed them then to basically contract other military sources to help them police this expanding empire based on economics. It was truly an economic empire
Mm.
that just spread throughout the world. North America, Asia, India. We had all over, and it only came about because of the ships that generated that allowed them to go to other parts of the world that were able to secure resources that they in turn could sell and generate massive amounts of money. So then we'd see like the British East India Company come to power. There was basically another military arm of the British government because that they use financially to pay for to help them acquire their wealth. So that's a great example of that. The USSR, massive land area. They started with Russia, and that really can go back hundreds of years before all that too. But they use Russia generally as its base country and just spread out as well. For them, it's a little bit different because it's a lot in their history is about having borders. They're really important. They're really big as a people about having border protection, buffer zones. So for them, their expansionism was very much about one of, to a degree, a little bit of isolationism. To a degree, that term kind of rubs me wrong a lot, but it's more creating buffer zones. Russia's been very big on that, whether it's Asia when they fought a disastrous war against Japan, or it's throughout the East, obviously as well. So, case in point, when Hitler turned his back on Stalin and invaded, it was like, whoa, we can't have this. So they mobilized the entirety of the country. Every person became involved because for them, their border was everything. So they would have the satellite countries and states. So that's really what the USSR was, is having buffer zone states to
Mm.
protect Mother Russia itself. And that really came about from expansionism, protectionism, and so on. Plus, it gave them greater economic strength with more countries involved in it at the time. Granted, communism's a failed principle, but it took a while, obviously, for that to play out. So now, when you put it in context for the USSR to how long it took for its creation to its fall, when compared to Byzantium, it's I think you can relate it to the nature of how modern society has evolved from Byzantium to now, but the principles are the same.
Mm.
You can't, you can't spend more than you take in, and that's part of what collapsed the Soviet Union, to be honest, as well as their political system didn't foster a vibrant economy, anyways. So it really was a double whammy there. So there's a lot to be said for what occurred, that the principles definitely translate to modern society and modern empires that we've seen from Britain to the Soviet Union.
Hmm. Oh, absolutely fantastic. And going bringing it then full circle, going back to yourself. Um, you also, alongside this fantastic book, also write a whole host of articles for magazines, websites, journals. Alongside writing a book such as this.
Yeah.
What drives you then to spread your work so widely and be so active? And what advice would you give to then someone looking to get into something similar?
Sure. Well, I definitely do dabble in a lot of avenues for history, and really, it just stems from passion.
Mm.
When you're passionate about anything, I think it's so important, especially in contemporary society, that follow your passion. The old adage, if there's a will, there's a way. There absolutely is. And as a historian, one of the most important things is to build credibility. Credibility in history is so important because it becomes your reputation, becomes your business card.
Mm.
You want it to be reflective of your passion, but also your diligence, your accuracy, your ability to engage others. And there are many different types of history writing. There's academia, and there's all that stuff. And I think wherever you feel your niche is, that's where, and you're passionate about it, whether it's one specific topic or a broad. it's just pursuing that. And there's so many ways to do it. There are great websites out there that always look and they hunger for great historians to provide material. Granted, a lot of times it's volunteer, but you know what? That's a great thing because it builds your reputation. It gets more work out. And then you have to also kind of self-promote yourself. There's different social media avenues, getting your work out there, letting others partake of it, being accessible. For me, I'm always fascinated by a lot of things. So I like to write about a lot of different things. And depending on what the avenue is, I will tailor it slightly to fit that. But one of the things I always believe in is to make history accessible to everybody,
Mm,
whether you're a long-term 30-year veteran and writing historical books and presentations, or you're just a layman that has a passing interest in it. To me, it's important to write so that anybody can engage in it and get something out of what I write and be excited by it. So for me, when I write, whether it's an online article for one of the many places I write for every month, or it's a contracted piece for a print magazine, which I have a lot of those lined up in the next 18 months too, that it's going to be the same quality and the same excitement I put in every piece, whether it's an article I chose or it's one I've been asked to write about, because history has fallen off the marker, if you will, in too many countries around the world about it's being taken away in universities. Schools aren't really putting it out there in a way I think is viable and engaging. I mean, I was always that fortunate kid, that oddball, I guess, where I loved all of it in school, no matter how boring the professor was. But so my goal is I'm passionate about it. I get excited. I'm energized by it at my age now that I was when I was a kid. So I always try to convey that both in conversation, but how I write as well, because I want others to see history's a lot more than just dates. It's always comes down to the people that live that situation,
yeah.
and that to me is the exciting part. When you put it all together, it's uncovering the layers of who that person was, trying to understand how they related in that situation or that event. So it just brings it all to life then. So just keeping engaged in the work, putting your name out there, putting yourself out there, making some good contacts. A good support structure is critical. That you can bounce your ideas off from, your work off from, people that support you. That's going to just continue to build on itself. And that will begin to get any historian a reputation, and a strong one at that. So just passionate, engaged, and consistent, I would say, are the three keys for historical work.
Oh, fantastic. And I can clearly see your passion that has come through this episode. So thank you so much for coming. And it's been an absolutely lovely to chat with you and talk about the Byzantines.
Thank you
So
so much. It's been great.
you're more than welcome. So thank you very much. And thank you to everyone watching. That is the end of the interview. So thank you very much. And make sure to check out the other videos that are available. Cheers.